Start to my variables.
You will come here.
Yeah,
No.
not now. Yeah, all right.
Good morning. How are you? Should be fine. No hangover? No? You didn't go to this bar, restaurant? No. Good. Okay. Remember yesterday one of Keynotes was on screen. So to avoid any new problems, I decided to go to airport to pick our next speaker, not to lose him. So I was there. The flight was late, but it's a usual situation nowadays. And but the end is happily he is found. So I would like to welcome here Professor Dominic Wyse, and he is a professor of early childhood and primary education at University College London. I hope I translate correctly this abbreviation. Faculty of Education and Society. He is founding director of the Helen Hamlin Center for Pedagogy and a research center devoted to improving young children's education. Dominic is also president of British Educational Research Association. And the main focus of Dominic's research is curriculum and pedagogy, which includes the sustained and contribution to knowledge about teaching, writing, reading, and creativity. Dominic has extensive experience of working as the interface of research, policy, and practice, particularly in relation to his work on national curriculum, but also including his work on education as an academic discipline. Dominic's research on reading, writing, and curriculum has attracted widespread media attention. His currently research projects include children's agency in national curriculum. So please welcome Professor Dominic Wyse. He's happy to have.
Thank you, everyone, and very good morning. Linda, thank you so much, especially for finding me at the airport, which was it's always interesting when you first arrive. And thank you for driving me through the unexpected rain. Apparently, you've been out here at Riga, it's been the same as in London and Cambridge, where we've had so much sunshine, it's unbelievable. And it rained for the first time, and it rained for 24 hours just before I left. So it's kind of a welcome rain. So my talk today, I've called it Defining a Discipline. This is something that's preoccupied me. It's about what is education in wider society, in universities. How should we think about what education is, particularly as an academic discipline in universities? Now, in order to explore this idea or the ideas around it, this is bound up with teachers, teacher education, teacher training. Obviously, it's bound up with what happens to pupils in schools and indeed students in universities and colleges. But for me, it's also about politics. And I feel that education has always perhaps been a political area in society, but certainly I see trends of politics becoming more entwined and resistances beginning to happen. So that's the basic idea of the talk. And so I want to begin, like the good academic I hope I am, with a very little bit of talk about defining what I mean by discipline or a field, or reflecting on that. Now I want to share with you some information about the very large-scale research excellence framework, which applies to the countries of the United Kingdom, so England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and every single university has to go through that assessment process. I then want to focus in on one particular research project that I led and that is very much connected to the issues that I'm introducing today. This was the Close to Practice research project. And then I've identified, to finish with, 3 challenges that I think face teacher education, certainly in universities in the UK. But I've chosen these issues because I think they will resonate with some of the things that everyone here experiences in their work in teacher education and in education departments in universities. Okay, so we've just had the results are out, and this is a big moment for universities in the UK because, to be crude, lots of money, perhaps not lots of money, significant sums of money will go to the universities who are successful in this, and very little money for researchers will go to universities who are not successful. So this is the way of distributing a certain amount of money to every department that all education departments have, and try and get this income stream for research. And for the first time when it was done, it takes, it actually takes about 5 years. It's done every 5 years. And it takes 5 years to build up the cases, and the universities work very hard to get the best possible case. But for the first time in the Research Excellence Framework 2021, all academic staff had to be entered into the REF. And what this means is they have to say what their best research publications are. The university has to write a case about what impact its research has had in the world, and it has to also show that its environment for doctoral students, for researchers generally, is a strong one, is a coherent one, and so on. But let me come back to what is an academic discipline, really, what is education. You can see that, so there are 5 panels, and what's called panel C is social sciences. Well, for those of you interested in disciplinary studies, describing education as a social science rather than, for example, an art and humanity may cause you to cause a bit of annoyance even. However, in many places, education is defined or known as a social science discipline. And then I've just quoted from the executive summary. So the submissions from all the UK universities were very varied in size, with a wide range of disciplines, and this is quoting, including both very small and very large units, and well-established and new research groups. So the main panel, which education is included in, alongside a lot of other social sciences, describes education as a discipline. And it goes on to say, again, research in the social sciences and other disciplines covered by the main panel continues to produce outputs of world-leading quality. And I'll say a little bit more about what world-leading quality means in a moment. Now I'm turning to the report from the education subpanel itself. So this is a panel of people like ourselves who peer review all the work that is submitted. And in the first sentence of the education subpanel report, you can see it says, education is a large, diverse and interdisciplinary field of research. That's, of course, contradictory to what the main panel report said. And this, at the heart, this is an important area of debate. And for me, it really does matter what we call it. From my point of view, I've been arguing now for some years that education is an academic discipline, just like any other academic discipline. And I have them delving around in the reports from mathematics or physics or psychology, and I see no important differences apart from when disciplines emerged historically. So although it's only a word, I think sometimes we do like to discuss single words and their meaning. So I am doing that now. And you can see there's a little bit more information there about the amount of submissions there are. By the way, if you want a quick and easy read, I hope, why I think this and how I defend this position about what is a discipline, I was surprised to find that my EERA blog became the most read blog. I don't know whether it still is. One of you may have hit me to the top of the table, but I do go through the edition. I give some evidence to why I think education is an academic discipline. Let me now turn more and more to the quality of research and where it happens. So, still with the 2021 report, this is where I said I come back to world-class research. So I'm afraid every single research output gets a number from 1 to 4. And 4 is exceptionally good, 4-star, that's world-leading. Graded 1 and 2 are good pieces of work, in fact, very good pieces of work. It's just that the bar is set as high as possible. But you can imagine if your work, your paper, is graded 1 internally by your peers, you're not going to be over happy, and we'd all rather have a 4-star. But I know from experience that's no easy feat. However, the more important thing here is perhaps the figure in green, where you can see that taken across all the universities in the UK, just thinking about publications, what's called outputs, education scored 61.6% in 2014, and it's risen to 67.9% in 2021. So that's a good news story. That's only one small detail of what is a wealth of information about what kind of research is going on, what its impact is like, but it is important nevertheless. So, good news story. We can always do better though. And this is another one of my themes about education in universities and education research. We can always do better and we need to do better. So you can see here, there's a comment from the panel report saying outputs that gained lower grades were limited to, or some of them were limited to, descriptive or experiential accounts. So this is, of course, research, we've all probably read it, that may well be very valuable for practitioners, for example, for teachers, and this is a key discussion point. But in terms of peer review in research terms, it's regarded as, descriptive is regarded as a weakness, or experiential, what we might sometimes say, anecdotal evidence. Actually, that's too harsh. It is peer-reviewed work. But also teacher education itself, and this is, of course, at the heart of this conference, and your work and my work. Research was done on teacher education. This is another positive aspect. The panel noted that there was a strand of work on divergence in policy and practice across the jurisdictions of the UK, the countries I mentioned. Most notably, recent changes in England. I will say more about that as I go on. But it's this point about valuable evidence and critical comparative analysis. And that's something that I'm going to do today. I'm not doing comparative study, but this idea of critical comparative analysis is important for me as well. So let's go back then to the 2014 report. The reason I'm going to do this is it was the stimulus for the research project that I want to share some information with you about. So in 2014, there were more of these lower graded outputs or publications in education than in other social science subjects. So for example, in sociology or psychology, they scored basically better than education, and the education panel chair quite rightly pointed out this out, and there isn't any particular reason perhaps why that should have been, although I will explain what I think some of the reasons. But at that time, education also had the lowest proportion of staff actually submitted, and that was a worry. The numbers of staff in education departments really matters. The numbers of doctoral students who are coming through, the numbers of early career researchers, that really is the health of a discipline. And so that was a worry. This time in 2021, everyone had to be submitted if they had research as part of their job, which in the UK, those who do teacher education or teacher training do have research as part of their job in nearly all cases. Now, I've said here that the low submission of staff numbers is reflected in the fact that teacher education happens in universities. And so we have a very important age-old contrast between the work of training teachers, which is theoretical, but it's also practical. And it differs to some degree from the work that people, for example, who, let's say a PhD student does a PhD straight after their master's and undergraduate studies, and then they enter a social science, they enter education as a social scientist. It's a different route from those who perhaps were teachers themselves and then become teacher trainers, as indeed I did many years ago. And so I think teacher education, it was and still is bound up with these issues around quality of education research, because it's about the access and time that one has to do it. And this report in 2014 also, I quote the phrases that were used, talked about practice focused, but in particular talked about what was called close to practice research. And incidentally, this idea of close to practice research, you may be familiar with terms such as action research, case study perhaps, research, ethnography even in some cases. So this is research where it's very much about the practices of education. And of course, not all education research is like that. For example, where I work at the Institute of Education at UCL, we run longitudinal studies, some of which have been going on for 20 years, that track, for example, young people, children's development over many, many, many years, and draw conclusions about, for example, how social class, gender, race may affect progress in education and in life. However, this report at this point was focusing on those people who did what it called close to practice research. And it made it clear that it thought it was variable in quality, which means that actually a substantial amount of it was not achieving the higher grades of world-class or at least internationally recognized. And so a research project was born. And now, at the time, I was not the president of the British Education Research Association. I was a member of BERA. BERA advertised a competitive tender to do the research project, and I was really pleased that with the team that you see there, we won the tender and were very pleased to carry out the research. The research also involves regular meetings with the BERA steering group, who kept us all to task very much and asked difficult questions and made lots of suggestions. So that was a really interesting process. Now, let me tell you a little bit more very briefly about the project and some of its findings. So the aim of this then was to basically examine close to practice research, in particular in relation to the quality of the research, and to try and make recommendations for how things could be improved. And so it was two parts to the methodology. The larger part was the rapid evidence assessment, so a form of systematic review, and I'll just go into a little bit of the detail of that. In particular, we wanted to look at peer-reviewed publications, research papers that themselves focused on close to practice research. This was rather complicated because the idea of close to practice research, although it had been mentioned actually in the health sector in a paper in 2005 by Trish Cook, it wasn't really a well understood term. And there were lots of other terms I will briefly tell you that people used and research that was done that was close to practice. But that was our task, and so we had to get on with it. And it's important also to note that, yes, we were interested in people doing research about practice. So it could be about the teaching of mathematics, the teaching in early years, it could be about teacher education, but it had to be about the practices. But we were also interested in theoretical studies, methodological studies. So there are a lot of people who write about the issues to do with education, research in education and practice, theoretically, philosophically. So two main categories. And the smaller part of the study was interviews. We did 7 interviews. Now, the important thing about this is the interviewees. And so they were some of the most eminent and most experienced people who had, in some cases, a whole career, 30, 40 years of experience dealing with leading research organizations, leading universities, leading teacher training departments in universities, and being a teacher trainer for many, many years. So we wanted to test the ideas that we found in the published work by talking to these interviewees about their experiences and about what their views were. This may not be, certainly not very clear for me. Basically, what you've got here is a flow diagram of the rapid evidence assessment. And as you can see, if you look at the top, we have where you start with all those 1,343 titles and abstracts. Now, I said I've mentioned the categories. So you can see there that we found 252 publications. that we categorise as practitioner research. And we do in the paper, we do have we explain what these categories are. We also found 204 publications that describe themselves as doing or thinking about action research, and so on. So you can see some of those categories were kind of pretty well established, but others were very new. So the idea of knowledge transfer research had only attracted 36 publications to that point. And then, as some of you will know, the way these systematic reviews work, you start with the abstracts and then you have to reject lots and lots of them, because in the end, the titles and the abstracts are not actually core to our research questions. And so also note that while we did a standard systematic review techniques, we also had the steering group making suggestions of places they wanted us to look. So it says there on the right-hand side, education research, 115 titles from journals, or indeed our team and the steering group that were recommended and got looked at. Anyway, so it all gets boiled down. In the end, we had 47 publications that we felt were important to be read in full. To be a proportion of those, we checked that our coding, as you call it, was in agreement. So we had some iterative reliability. We then also have to split it out. So we write about things that are relevant internationally, but also we were required to write about things relevant to the UK. And so that's a very quick visual idea of the huge amount of work that mainly the full-time researcher on the team did. But what did it tell us? Well, I want today to focus on just a particular idea around quality. And remember that part of our job was to try and find out if there were weaknesses, what were they, and how could they be improved in terms of education research that is close to practice. And obviously we needed to note what was strong about those 3-star, 4-star, not that we would know, by the way, that's not public information. We had to regrade and so on. Anyway, overall, what we found was that in the studies that we regarded as stronger, first and foremost, there was an original contribution to the discipline, to the world of research, and that was made explicit. And of course, that original contribution could be to do with an aspect of teaching, but wasn't always. And again, it's perhaps obvious to people here, but it's, of course, as usual, it's easy to know something. It's quite another thing to write it in a way that will be regarded by our peers as, outstanding, as internationally world leading. And so when it says there robust use of the methodology, this of course means that these people studying close to practice had to be very knowledgeable and expert at the use of research methodology. And this wasn't coming across in some cases. And by the way, I've spent 9 years as an editor of 2 different journals. And so I have been one of the people saying, you're rejected, sorry. In fact, 80% of the papers that came in both those journals got rejected. 80%. It is a high rejection rate. And often they fail to do what some of these stronger studies did. And then finally, for the stronger studies, the theorization was appropriate. I've said sufficient there. I think it was appropriate. Oh, and that's not evident, that should be, not violent. That doesn't mean I made up a word there, sorry. So they were theorized. They had a clear theoretical framing, perhaps, or the whole paper was a theoretical account. What about the weaker studies? And of course, this is a corollary to the stronger in some ways. So too descriptive. Now, you'll remember earlier I mentioned that issue with being too descriptive. And, I still will occasionally fall into the trap of describing and not actually getting to the nub of things in first draft. So I'm not immune from all these mistakes myself. Research that was under-theorized. I think here there's a really interesting disciplinary difference. So I work a lot with psychologists, where I find myself, they just think completely differently. In my background, actually, I was saying to Linda yesterday, a long time ago, I was a musician, and I still am a musician, of course, but I think differently because of that, I think. But I love working with psychologists and neuroscientists as well, provided they will eventually, come a little bit over to our side, if I can put it like that. But I think they don't attend to theory in the same way. Psychologists don't attend to theory in the same way that educationists do, in my experience, and it's a really interesting area. And you can see, yes, in the weaker outputs, publications, there was a lack of detail about methodology. Now, again, let me go back to my journal editing. You might think, well, that's obvious, we never make that mistake. The amount of papers I've read where they don't even tell you how many participants were in the research. And I don't care if it's a really good qualitative study. I want to know how many participants there were in the research. So, and then finally, perhaps most important of all in some ways, the scale of the research. And I don't think we need to be defensive about the scale of research. We just need to be honest. I mean, when I look back at the first research I ever did, in fact, that would be my first master's degree when I was still a teacher in primary school, doing it part-time. And I look back at that research now and I think, yeah, I could have done that a lot differently. And I guess that's just human nature. But nevertheless, I'm to some degree proud of that small-scale study. So the scale of the study relates to people's development. It relates to what we say about it. It relates to what is research. And what do we regard as high quality research? And whether we like it or not, a study, let's say, randomized controlled trial with 35 schools in 2 arms of the trial, thousands and thousands of pupils, tens of thousands of tests to mark, is a really significant piece of work, whether we happen to agree with it philosophically or not. And it's different from somebody, well, I can say now, someone who's done 7 interviews, although that wasn't the whole study. So I just wanted to have a quick look at, as I'm here for the first time, thank you very much, in Latvia, I wanted to look at what goes on, apparently, according to Udice, before I talk about some other parts of the picture. So I picked these out because they were interesting to me. Apparently, no doubt you'll be able to put me straight on this if it's inaccurate. No standard curriculum requirements in teacher education in Latvia, in terms of what they call the pedagogical sciences. So no standard curriculum. That's important to me, as you'll hear in a moment. Seen as a whole, the pedagogical part of teacher training consists of 2 components, theoretical and practical. Well, as you'll see at the moment in England, the government thinks we don't need the theoretical, thank you very much. All we need is the practical. So that's why that interested me. I was really interested in these disciplines or subjects that have been introduced in recent years, apparently. Philosophy of upbringing I thought was really interesting, but several philosophical aspects here. Well, education as an academic discipline in the UK began by a small group of people saying, we need to make education look better, frankly. So we're going to say it's built on the founding disciplines of philosophy, psychology, sociology, and history of education. I should have said philosophy of education, because of course, mainstream philosophy is rather different from philosophy of education. Currently, government doesn't like that idea, although, and I have some reservations about that because it weakens the claim to education itself. Education doesn't need, in my view, to bolster itself by saying, well, we're really philosophy or we're really psychology. It's strong enough in its own right, as you will see if you read some of the stuff I published. And then the organisation of higher education in Latvia and where the teacher training happens, this is crucial as well. So these tiers, we have had this in the UK, we have it less so at the moment. However, we do have a different challenge where teacher training can and is done on the job, as it were. We call it on-the-job training in schools, where universities have very little role, and so that has been a competitive marketplace. Anyway, I like what I see from the descriptions I've read anyway. I think I'd rather be working in Latvia. Anyway, now, back to England then. So I see, and this is the last part of my talk, I see really three challenges that arise from some of the things I've been saying. So the first challenge is that, as I've said, all colleagues, all academic staff in UK universities must contribute to the government-mandated research excellence framework. So that means they come under pressure, and some might say perfectly reasonable pressure, to get the research funding, to publish the research, but at the same time, they have to deliver outstanding teacher education, teacher training. And so at the same time, they have pressure from the inspectorate, who are called Ofsted, who come round and are much less friendly than even the ref, and either say, yes, you're doing a good job, or you're really not doing a good job, and we'll close you down if you're not careful. And it really is that draconian. So that's challenge one. I'm thinking about my colleagues who come into a place like the Institute of Education in London. They come in having been a teacher. They want to train teachers, that's their job. And pretty soon they learn it's not only that they have to do, but they also have to produce world-leading research if possible. And that's really demanding. My second challenge is about, I'm calling government interference. I'm sure government wouldn't call it that. They'd say, oh, we're just making everything better. To me, they're interfering in curriculum and pedagogy in universities. And I have just a very brief example of an aspect of my research, an area that I know about, teaching of reading, just to give you an example of where I see problems there. And this challenge 3 doesn't happen too much, but we don't want to be attacking each other when we've got governments, we've got other disciplines, all challenging us and inspectors. So there is, it's an important debate, but nevertheless, I'll let you judge whether you think it's a fruitful debate, because I was involved in it. Right, now, I'm sorry, there's quite a bit of text on these slides. I've tried to highlight what I think is the important things. So, the government in the UK at the moment, we've had the unfortunate experience of Boris Johnson being ejected from being Prime Minister for some bad behaviour. We're waiting to hear who will take over. But his government, and particularly the Department for Education, said we're going to do a review, yet again, of teacher training. Now, personally, I think this is politically motivated more than it is motivated by a genuine desire to improve teacher education. I know that's quite a big claim, but you'll see as I take you through the evidence. Now, the ITT market review report we were horrified, let me put it that way. A lot of institutions were absolutely horrified, angry, and could see this kind of the government's naked aggression in trying to interfere in teacher training. In fact, more than that, some would say they're trying to remove it from universities. They're basically, they just want it like a marketplace, like a commercial marketplace where schools can do the training. You don't need university, you don't need theory, you don't need research. And there's a perception also that we're all left-wing, anti-conservative, which of course is not true. But this is the University of Cambridge, unusually, were the first to make a very strong statement. And what was unusual was this wasn't just from the Faculty of Education at Cambridge, where I'd worked prior to UCL. This was from the highest level of the university, second to highest, nearly the Vice Chancellor level. And the statement said, the government is confusing quality with uniformity. Uniformity, that's, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of governments trying to control and make things uniform. Cambridge said, we cannot continue with teacher training if those proposals are done. And that is a shocking statement for an 800-year-old university. Cambridge doesn't make these statements lightly. It's astonishing. Threatening, basically, to withdraw. Now, and they weren't alone. Lots of organisers, in fact, BERA itself made a very strong statement and was a public consultation, which I'll show you. But this is causing great unhappiness. By the way, I should say that you'll see the government moved a little, didn't really move, and none of these universities, including my own, we're all still taking the money. And that's not unimportant, of course, because it's about people's jobs. So this is a really, really difficult situation. So there was the report I just started talking about, and then there was a consultation on the report, which many of us responded to, BERA responded to, and then the government responds itself and replies. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complicated because the government contracted a private consultancy firm to do the analysis of the data. We do not have transparent reporting of the data, I'm afraid. So it's very difficult to know. I'm not suggesting this organisation didn't do the job well. I'm sure they did. However, we just can't peer review it, and it's not being peer reviewed in the way we would like. So this consultancy report said fewer respondents disagreed with the curriculum quality requirements in principle. Now, what that means is this is basically a new curriculum for teacher training. So the government, you or I, we're not going to decide what the curriculum is for our trainees, for our future teachers. The government's going to decide. That's why I quoted from the Latvian situation. And then there is this point about the evidence base. So lots of people, in my view, I suspect, rather more than is suggested here, it's why I've put how many, lots of institutions, lots of individuals have concerns about where's the evidence that the government has for changing the curriculum in university departments. What is that evidence? And I'll show you an example in a moment. There was also opposition to a uniform curriculum, and some felt that this was completely overlooking what universities or higher education institutions do when they deliver teacher education. So here's how the government responded. So the first recommendation in the ITT market review was that providers should develop an evidence-based training curriculum. No problem with that. That's the heart of why, this is why teacher education in universities is so good, because you can bring together researchers with practitioners in productive ways, and the students get the best outcome. But this is the red text shows how the government made a tiny shift. It says the government said they are clear that the core content framework, that's basically a national curriculum for teacher training, is a minimum entitlement, not a full curriculum. And providers should continue to exercise their autonomy. Okay, well that's interesting. So therefore, can I or my colleagues ignore the government curriculum and just do what we want? Oh no. No, because the government will use quality assurance processes. This is the inspectors, the police force of education, coming round to ensure that the evidence used is coherent with the framework. And here is where I will use anecdotal evidence. So colleagues have told me, for example, that a paper that I've recently published, and I'll show you in a moment, they've had a sort of inspectors sort of saying quietly, well, I don't think you should put that paper on your reading list for your students, because it's not allegedly following the government line. Now, it's very difficult to get proof of these things, isn't it? They happen quietly, they're never documented, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is happened. But more seriously, what will happen is inspectors will go to our departments and they'll say, well, you're not using our curriculum that we said you should use, therefore we fail you. So let me give one example. It is a contentious example in many English-speaking, where English language is dominant. This whole thing about how you teach young children to read. Should you emphasize the alphabetic code? Should you start with whole texts and so on? It's a really contentious debate at times. But the government has a very strong view. Now, this is England now. The government in England has a very strong view. So they say, if you're going to teach early reading, it has to be synthetic phonics. It has to be. And if you don't do that in your university department, they will fail you. It really is like that. I've been thinking about this for a long time and researching it. And these are quoted from the National Curriculum for University Teacher Training. It's not just universities, actually, it's also other organisations that do teacher training. And it says, you know, systematic synthetic phonics is the most effective approach. Okay, well, you can make that claim. So let's see the evidence. There must be lots of citations, surely, to back this up. There must be strong evidence in this national curriculum. There we are. Literally one study is cited. I happen to know the author joined an online talk that I organised, a very interesting piece of work, but it's certainly not the whole story. I mean, we've been researching reading for more than 100 years. We have tertiary reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, but they just said, well, one reference. Cherry picking of the worst kind. I mean, so this is like some civil servant saying, oh, crikey, the minister wants synthetic phonics. Oh, there's that study, that'll do. That'll clip, you know. I mean, unbelievable. Even by what has happened in England over the last 10 or 20 years. One reference. This is why, by the way, I think that's probably not the only reference you need. The paper that I'm talking about, which will appear on this slide at the moment, it's one of those rare moments, I think it's rare, where suddenly myself and my colleague Alice Bradbury, we did the work, did the research, we wrote the paper, we find ourselves all over the headlines, which is very unusual for a piece of education research to be page one. Or, in fact, Boris Johnson was being accused of partying during COVID, and for a while we were more important story even than Partygate. You know, having we made it there, it lasted until about midday when Prime Minister's questions happened, and then Partygate became top of the chart. But yeah, it wasn't just the Guardian. In fact, nearly every newspaper in the UK and internationally was covered. We had contact from the Ministry of Education Ontario, Canada, because they were facing a challenge to their reading policy, telly, you know. Anyway, so that was a bit strange for, normally we just keep our heads down, don't we, and get on with our job, but there we are. If you want to read the paper, I warn you, it's a whole 20,000 words long. I think it's the longest paper, peer-reviewed research paper ever published on the subject. Now, nor would I say that's enough. Of course, no one paper is enough. But what we did was we said, oh, by the way, there are 8 systematic reviews, 8. So each one of those consists of tens of thousands of abstracts whittled down. So at the very least, this report is terribly, terribly biased in its treatment of research evidence. And another aspect to how they dealt with the evidence claim in this new curriculum for university education departments and their teacher training, you can see I've circled there what they say. And that really is the main claim, that it just says the ITT core content framework and its underpinning evidence has been independently assessed and endorsed by the Education Endowment Foundation. So one organisation, which by the way is government funded, so there's a definitely a difficult thing there. Becky Francis, you will see, is listed there as the Institute of Education, which she was at the time, but she's now head of the Education Endowment Foundation. By the way, they do some really good work. Some of it, I think, is excellent work. But to have that blanket statement, it's like stamp approved, off you go, is not enough. And I can't believe that some of those people, many of whom are eminent, could have known that they would be used in that way. I don't know. Their names are there, and I'll have to ask them. So, and finally, yes, my third challenge is I've called it attacking each other. Well, it's not that bad. It's a bit of a disagreement in a special issue. But it actually, in fairness to the editors in the end, it was a rocky process. I think it was a rocky process to get this special section together. I wasn't involved in the editing, I was just a contributor. But I think they have done something useful. It's certainly been a contentious debate, and it has enabled others to think even more about close to practice research. What is it? What does it mean? How do we get good quality? So, one of the contributors who'd written a full paper, I'm boiling down what was a complex, relatively complex philosophical argument, accused Vera's statement, and indeed our close to practice report, of showing methodological imperialism. I don't know about you, but I don't like being called an imperialist, and I don't believe I am, or my team. And also said that it reflected methods fetishism. Ooh, dear. And we did take an opportunity to play a little bit with this idea of fetishism and methods. We obviously disagreed. But what the serious point was that Horden was claiming that because we use a systematic review, and because we set up our research design in that way to address the Vera close to practice research project, that was somehow fetishism. I think it's bound up with the age-old debate for me about quantitative versus qualitative, which I thought we'd moved beyond, and I think we really do need to move beyond, actually. And yes, we were accused by another contributor of epistemological leanings. I don't like the sound of that at all. Yes, that's right, leanings that are quantitative and that great word positivist. So I say this to all my students. How can you be a positivist? What is a positivist? Like, do you think I have a monotheoretical way of thinking? No, I think about the world in certain ways. That is my epistemological way of thinking, but it cannot be crudely summarized as a positivist. Other contributors actually disagreed themselves rather strongly with Horden's allegations. His main argument was that we were pursuing I think he called it a regulative or an instrumental approach, whereas his argument was that education is a normative, mainly a normative endeavour. In other words, values are at the heart of education. Well, nothing we did was saying that values are not at the heart of education. And one of the other contributors, I think, really helpfully identified the tension between rigour and relevance. And so, as I said earlier, research methods and how they're used, the research design is crucial. And one has to really, really understand the research design, the methods, the debates about methods, really understand it before even choosing methods. and those methods must be relevant to the research questions. Overall, though, I think this for me is going back in time. It's what some call the paradigm wars, quant versus qual. That's been actually the epistemological issues have been the concern of some philosophers for a very, very, very long time. I kind of worry a bit when we get even our master's students have to dutifully do the section in their dissertation about epistemology. I worry about that because how can you do justice to epistemology in 250 or 500 words? But the issue for me, I've boiled it down into what I think is a little simple equation. Does method X equal value position Y? So if I'm using method X, I have done randomized control trials. Does that mean I have certain values? Well, of course it doesn't. You know, my values are something they're bound in with the methods I use, but it doesn't mean I therefore have certain values. And as a team, we found that really the bit that was verging on offensive, because the research team on the Close to Practice project have used multiple methods. I myself have done, I'm in the middle of an ethnography at the moment, but I've also done randomized controlled trials, and all the other team members have similarly diverse experiences of research. So, and also what wasn't done by Horden was there was no citation of this long history of debate, which actually he was unearthing yet again. Even, you know, in work that I'm very familiar with because I was the lead editor, the Vera Sage Handbook of Educational Research. The introduction is some 10,000 words, and the editors address this whole issue of paradigm wars, and we say, we've moved on. Education as an academic discipline has quite rightly moved on, because there are much more important things that we need to be engaging with than what might be called a petty internal squabble. I don't think it is. I think it's more important than that, but that's the risk, and that's what it seems. So, to finish, I think you probably heard me argue that education is an academic discipline and it's comparable to any other discipline. I started some work on this on for my presidential address 3 years ago. I'm going to do some more work on this now. We have the data from the Research Excellence Framework, but nothing shakes my view that it is, and to call it otherwise is risky. I am continually curious, and this is where I'm interested in your experiences in other countries, whether the way government in England controls education is an outlier internationally. Certainly, I've argued in terms of the teaching of reading, England is an outlier. I don't know enough actually about how teacher education is done in different countries of the world, but certainly something I'm interested in. The much more important point overall is that evidence must take preference over ideology. And we have I know every country has debates about what are the politicians doing, why are they doing it, are they doing it for the reasons of evidence? And of course, you know, one of the things about COVID was we saw, certainly in the UK, on telly every night, scientists standing with Boris Johnson. And for me, that actually was quite important. We've already had a backlash from some far-right people saying, well, scientists should never have been involved. So, I think this is really important, isn't it? Evidence taking preference over ideology. And I've been telling you about teacher educators. What can they do? What are they allowed to do? The same can be applied to teachers. What are teachers allowed to do? And what are pupils allowed to do? So my work on agency, which I've not talked about today, what autonomy do pupils have? Because obviously teachers have a level of control. But overall, it's professional autonomy is one of the issues that's at stake here. And I think we need to trust teacher educators teaching more. And finally, for my talk today, it's got to be about working together. We're too easily divided. It's too risky to divide ourselves. So we need to be working closely with education practitioners in research, in training, in professional development. And this is because it's about education as an academic discipline. But it's also about the job of teaching, which in my view is a dynamic and exciting field of practice. So thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you. I will go to the microphone. I would say and believe that you will agree that situation not unique in your country. You gave example of Latvia. Of course, we are quite good in developing nice papers. I believe you do the same, political papers. And we also have some similar problems. But to thank you for your speech. Yesterday we gave everyone umbrellas, you remember. But as I picked him during very heavy rain, I realized he has umbrella. So he will have a different, very useful item. It's a thermomug. So you know you can use it for coffee, for tea, for beer, for whiskey. And no one will notice that. So thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have coffee break, and then we move to our parallel sessions. Okay?
Yeah.